Hello and welcome to another classical music podcast. My guest today is Maestro Berard, Jesus Manuel Berard, who is currently the conductor of the Prince George's Philharmonic in Maryland. Maestro Berard has been active in the DC area for a good long time now, and has, as a large portion of that activity, conducted many of the finest youth ensembles in the DC area. So, welcome, Maestro Berard.
Right.
I'm glad we finally get to meet almost literally face to face.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. And I don't need to remind you that we made several attempts to work together, right, as conductor and soloist, and hopefully,
Hopefully, one of these days, something will make it possible for people to,
yeah, hopefully in October we will have our first our first opportunity together.
Every time for the last 2 weeks, every time that I've seen somebody announce the Four Seasons, I thought, wait, I was supposed to do that with
Right.
Manny.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that, by the way, that there seem to be these kind of
Yes.
programming things, right?
Oh, totally. Every time I program something,
everybody programs the same thing.
every time I program a work, it doesn't matter whether it's a Brahms symphony or whatever. Then I find out that some of the orchestra in the region had the same idea, So my thought is like, brilliant minds think the same way,
And it doesn't even have to be because this happens to be the composer's anniversary year, but
Right.
as a violinist, one year everybody seems to be playing La Sinfonia Española, and the next year
Yeah.
nobody is.
That is true. That's true. It's the same kind of syndrome, I think, that when you buy or you're thinking of buying a particular car, all of a sudden you start noticing that car on the road everywhere.
Yeah, right. Maybe it's just that you're attuned to it, and otherwise it would have,
Exactly.
passed you by.
I think that's exactly what it is. I think the truth of the matter is that people are probably performing all the standard rip stuff somewhere, and then when the minute that you program it, you notice that somebody else has done the same thing.
Well, we'll talk about programming, because one of the questions that I'm sure you've encountered from many soloists, but we should talk about publicly, is whether it is advantageous to think of the rare gem that no one has programmed, that no one's even heard of,
right?
Whether that attracts an audience or doesn't, whether that involves greater difficulties for the orchestra in terms of rehearsing a piece they've never seen before or heard before.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, here's my take on it. I mean, there are so many factors that are involved in that. One is the skill level of the orchestra, and how conservative the orchestra members might be, right? I'm thinking of there's a friend of mine, a conductor, George Rothman, up in New York, and he has the Riverside Symphony. And that's all they do is repertoire that nobody else does, unknown repertoire. That is like their niche, And he's they've been at it for decades now.
And they have no interest in programming yet another Bruch concerto.
No,
but you bring them the long lost Chevalier Saint George concerto.
Yeah, right, exactly. And they just gobble it up, and so do their audiences. I mean, they developed over the years an audience that's specifically interested in the new and unknown.
Right, and it doesn't, for our listeners, what I should point out is that the new and unknown doesn't have to mean something that was written yesterday, something that audiences are afraid is going to be, off-putting and somehow not something they're familiar to listening. There is music from the 18th century, from the 19th century, that has been, I sometimes think sometimes justifiably, neglected.
That's right.
So many concerti that violinists play when they are students started their existence as standard repertoire concerti that professional performers would play, and then as standards rose and new and better pieces were written, these frankly not as original pieces get relegated first to second tier status and eventually shoved off onto off the professional circuit entirely.
That's right.
But sometimes a gem is overlooked. Have you ever done, for example, the Spohr Second Concerto?
I have not. No. I have to admit to you that I've never done any Spohr.
Yeah, there's an entire competition in Germany dedicated to him, and yet,
yeah, right. Well, let me tell you. I mean, apropos that, I don't know how many years ago, the League of American Orchestras had The last time that they had their annual conference in Chicago. The theme of that conference, I don't think it was that long ago. It might have been like 4 years ago, maybe. The theme of that entire conference was basically inclusion. Okay, all right. So inclusion both in orchestras, right? Having more, for example, so-called minority players in orchestras, more women, more Black musicians, more Hispanic musicians, and also the same in terms of repertoire. Um, more women composers, more Black composers. So this is something that has been very much in our minds, right? In the forefront in recent years, and as a result of that, we are discovering pieces by composers that we never even heard of before.
Right.
That are all
I had not heard
amazing.
of St. George, for example,
Right.
until
Exactly.
looking at some of the requirements for Juilliard auditions,
Yeah.
where they're strongly encouraging, overtly encouraging
Yep.
applicants to consider programming, works from underrepresented segments, women composers, and so forth.
That's right.
Before we go any further, I should also point out to our listeners that whereas in previous podcasts, up until the week before last, we tried to keep the question and answer segment to the end. What we are trying to do now is that anyone watching right now
Sure.
can feel free to jump in with a question, relevant or irrelevant,
Yep.
and we will do our best to field the questions in real time. So
Right.
if someone watching is confused, please speak up. Yeah, so the issue of inclusion is it's a nice little segue to something that is a bigger question: the role of programming for for a soloist, for a conductor, the role of programming
Right.
to consider inclusion
Yep.
and balance it against the pressures of logistics.
Yep.
You'd love to do this piece, but it involves 2 harps, 4 tubas, and
Right. Yeah. No,
how do you handle that?
well, I mean, look, one of the things that I'm really proud about, being the music director of the Prince George's Philharmonic, is the diversity of the orchestra, the diversity of its audience membership, and the diversity of the county itself that we serve. So this is something that we are all very conscious of in terms of programming. When I sit down to think about, okay, what am I going to do next year or 2 years from now? I start putting together programming that I think will be really balanced. In the old days, balanced programming basically meant that you picked like music of Saint-Saëns and music of Wagner and music of maybe De Falla or something like that, right? And that was considered like
You get a little Spanish, you get a little German, you get a little French.
Right, but they're all dead European white guys, and that's not the case anymore. I mean, we have discovered that there's such a treasure trove of great art, and I'm not just talking about music. I'm talking about art across the board.
Visual, absolutely.
Yeah, that we haven't tapped into, for whatever reasons, be it institutional racism, be it just convention, be it maybe just tradition, what we were taught in the conservatories,
Yeah.
But so anyway, so I try to build a season program that is both diverse and also quality, because I don't think you necessarily have to give one up for the other one.
But what do you do when the piece that is a representation of an underrepresented composer and is by no means a second-rate piece, but is really an unjustly overlooked gem?
Sure.
But involves extra rehearsals because it is unknown, or additional instrumentation. How do you balance those?
Well, we just did something like that. I'm trying to remember now because we've had to cancel so many things the past 2 years. Not the past 2 years, but since last spring, it seems like the past 2 years anyway, that I'm trying to remember when we did this. I think it was 2 years ago that we did a piece by George Walker, a fabulous composer who just died recently, as a matter of fact. He died after we performed the piece. He was still alive when we did that. And he was in his 90s. African-American composer, had won a laundry list of major awards. Incredible composer, but very difficult. And also his instrumentation was enormous. It was like what you were describing. It called for an expanded orchestra, and it called for additional rehearsal time and all of that. And we tackled it anyway because we felt that it was a worthy challenge, that it was a worthy cause to follow. So so you have to put everything on a balance.
Did you have to sacrifice? Did you have to do lighter instrumentation for other things to balance out the costs?
No, not really. We just bit the bullet and we did what was necessary, and we included it in our programming for the full blown orchestra. So if you can do it, if you can afford to do it, it's worthwhile. And you're on a tightrope. You have to think about whether you can afford to do what you want to do. You also have to think about not just affording it monetarily, but also
rehearsal time.
Yeah, is this the right fit for the orchestra? Are they going to be able to handle it?
How long will it take them to learn a piece that perhaps has not ever been performed? Right. It's totally tonal, totally accessible to the ear, but they can't very well go on YouTube and listen to what it sounds like, so they actually have to learn it. Right. I'm proud of myself. Some years ago I did a recording, Vladimir Lande.
Yes.
Maestro Vladimir Lande. We did a recording together in St. Petersburg of works by Ysaÿe and Wieniawski. And of the Ysaÿe works, one thing that I found that was almost like a student work of his is a piece called Saltarel Carnivalesque.
I don't know.
Short, flashy, really appealing, audience-pleasing. But for whatever reason, Ysaÿe had orchestrated it for full, like, Wagnerian-size orchestra. If I recall, we're talking about, like, 4 horns, 2 trombones. I don't remember if it had a tuba, but it had major brass forces and doubled woodwinds. And so we're talking about just the orchestra size for that one piece was 80 people. And it's a trivial little bonbon. It's a 5-minute long piece.
Right.
So I approached a friend, a disciple of Dr. Philip Lasser, a wonderful composer named Lane Harder, to rescore the thing.
Okay.
And he did a magnificent job rewriting the orchestration for 1 flute, 1 oboe, 1 clarinet, 1 bassoon.
Okay.
Which, aside from the financial constraints, it made the piece so much better because we're talking about literally a light, frivolous little work where the ridiculously large forces, are absurd.
And you were still able to perform it.
Absolutely, perform it, record it. The rewriting is how so much of opera, for example, made its way into the recital hall.
Right.
When Sarasate wrote the Carmen Fantasy, part of it was so that Carmen could be performed in a small town that might not be able to house an opera house and certainly would not be able to support an opera orchestra.
Sure.
So as far as the programming, we've just briefly touched on something that I wanted to ask you about. All the sort of different hats that a conductor wears.
Yeah.
And we didn't approach the biggest hats directly. We approached it from programming, but let's get into it.
Okay.
Pretend you're talking to the mom of a 12-year-old who is taking occasional private lessons.
Okay.
So they've been to a concert maybe once or twice in their lives.
Okay.
And she's not quite sure what it is that you do.
Yeah. Okay. What is that guy doing up there waving a stick?
Right.
Okay. Is he moving to the music? What is he doing? Why do they even need him up there? He looks like a clown, right?
Right.
All right. So first of all, it sounds like something my daughter said to me when she was young. She said, "Dad, basically you wave a stick for a living."
I don't know if people have seen the cartoon. I'm sure you've seen the cartoon. Conductor is conducting, a dog is sitting next to the conductor, so throw the stick.
Exactly. Or he's standing in front of a score, and it isn't a score. It's actually little pictograms, right? Showing him which way to move, right? So anyway, all right. So we could talk for the next 2 hours about this. Books have been written about this, right? The maestro, mystique, right?
Lebrecht, right?
The truth of the matter is that there are tangible and intangible things that a conductor does. A very famous story about the intangible is the fact that, you know, the Berlin Philharmonic had had a lot of great conductors, but one of the greatest was Wilhelm Furtwängler. And Furtwängler, for some reason, was indisposed or whatever, busy, something, occupied with something else. And so there was an assistant that was leading a rehearsal, and the rehearsal was going very badly. And Furtwängler walked in the middle of the rehearsal. He was able to return back to the hall, and he walks in, and the orchestra notices that Furtwängler is in the hall, and all of a sudden they sounded great. You know, all of a sudden they improved, and you know, so, and he didn't even have to wave a stick at them. It was just his presence that did it, right? So, you know, so there is all of that. The truth of the matter is that apart from the intangible, let's talk about the things.
We'll get into the intangible in a moment, but
the things that are practical. Okay, first of all, there's the stuff that you see on the podium, and then there's the stuff that you never see that's behind, you know, in the sidelines. Okay, right? All the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, as we say. One of the things that goes on behind the scenes that's critically important to what you see on the stage is study. All right, the conductor has to know the score really well. The conductor there's no conductor that should stand in front of an orchestra without knowing the score.
And that, by the way, you know, the big question of how do you as a conductor practice? Conductors will often say, I need to study the score.
Right.
So let's tell this.
Well, I mean, there are a number of ways of studying the score. It also goes into like a conductor's training, right? With, you know, a lot of ear training and sight singing and keyboard practice, keyboard skills, score reading, right? Practice, learning how to read transposing scores, so that if you're reading like an orchestral score, you know that the horn in F means that, you know, it reads a C, but it sounds, you know, an F a perfect fifth lower, or B flat clarinet, you know, reads a C and then it sounds a whole step lower. You know,
just to slow down and tell our hypothetical parent of the hypothetical child what transposing actually means.
Yeah.
If you've followed your kids' lessons and you've learned that, you know, every good boy does fine, or FACE, you know, face spells face. That's treble clef. That's one particular legend for the cryptograph that is music.
Right.
But a different clef will mean that instead of E, every good boy does fine, that the E is actually supposed to be read as a G, that the G is supposed to be read as a B, and so on. Right. That's transposing.
Right.
And what Maestro Berard is talking about, when you're looking at a given instrument, a conductor knows at a glance that although this instrument happens to be written where for a violin that note would be a C, for the instrument in question, that note is being read as an F.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So so that's, you know, so it's knowledge of the score, it's knowledge of the instruments. It's by the way, it is a fallacy that a lot of people think that conductors have to know how to play every instrument in the orchestra.
Oh yeah, right.
No, not at all. Not at all. They just simply have to know
how the instrument works.
Yeah, how those instruments work, how to talk to those players, right, in order to elicit the sound that you want. So, okay, so then after knowing the score, after studying it, after being able to contextualize the score historically, understanding the style of the historical period in which that composer was working, okay.
And again, let me jump in with the knowing of the score. I don't know if you're familiar with this potentially apocryphal story about Toscanini, but it may explain to the hypothetical mommy what knowing the score really, really means.
Yeah.
Arturo Toscanini was a legendary conductor, partially legendary for his ferocious temper, and for the terror in which musicians held him. So a few minutes before a concert, the story goes, the clarinetist knocks on his dressing room door, on Toscanini's dressing room door, and says, "Maestro, we have an emergency. Either you need to find," you know the story, right?
I know the story.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah. We need to either find a new instrument for me, or you need to find a new player. The combination of keys on the clarinet that makes the note E flat isn't working. Something is not functioning. I cannot play the note E flat, literally. And Toscanini said, "Wait one moment. That's okay. You don't have an E flat this evening."
Right.
And what happened in those few seconds is that he went through the overture,
right,
the concerto, the
yeah,
symphony, the entire program, the 2
certainly,
hours program.
right,
He went through it instantaneously,
right,
going just to the clarinetist's part
yeah,
and seeing whether one particular pitch is going to be played at all in the
right,
course of a 2 hours long program.
right. Well, you know, I had Laura Mazel come work with the DC Youth Orchestra one Saturday
Wow.
afternoon, and
Wow.
he showed up in his leisure suit. You know, it looked as if we just dragged him out of his living room. You know, all that was missing was his slippers. And so anyway, so he gets up on the podium, and the piece in question was the Beethoven Sixth Symphony.
Okay.
And so, you know, he didn't even have a baton. He borrowed my baton. You know, I gave him my baton. He kind of looked at it like, "You call this a baton?" Because he used like these enormous things like this, right? And so anyway, so he gets up on the podium, and he conducts rehearsal with no score in front of him whatsoever, right? Photographic memory, and he's like correcting notes, and of course he has, you know, anyone who knows him knows that he has perfect pitch, right? So, but I mean, it's amazing, you know, these great conductors, how they had Eric Leinsdorf was another one. He had photographic memory, you know.
Which means that in any given moment, he will not simply say that bassoon you're supposed to be playing an F you're playing an E. He will also be able, presumably, to tell you, you know, possibly even the measure number.
Right.
You know, this number of measures after this last episode.
Right. Right. That's really knowing the score. Okay. So anyway, so that's step one. Step one is, let's say, thoroughly knowing the score. Before you even stand in front of the orchestra. Then comes what is the conductor's most important job, which is interpretation. Okay. What a conductor does with an orchestra is no different, really, than what a soloist does, or let's say a pianist does when preparing a Beethoven sonata, in terms of trying to decipher what the composer was doing as much as one can, and interpreting it, right? Okay. I mean,
as a movie director would.
Exactly. I was just going to say, as an actor would, a great actor. How many great actors have interpreted, you know, the role of Brutus in Julius Caesar differently, you know, or Hamlet or something.
The words don't change, but the interpretation changes the
exactly.
personality.
The emphasis that's given, the feeling that's given, the way that it's colored, the way that it's paced, you know, all of that, right? So all of that goes into interpretation. So based on knowledge of the music, then any conductor has to basically interpret it. And then after doing that, then transmit that interpretation to the orchestra. And that's where what we call podium technique comes in, which is that, you know, conductors have a language of gestures. It's just like in baseball, you know, like the pitcher and the catcher are like doing this to each other, right? Okay, and they know what that means. Well, it's not unlike that with the conductor in an orchestra. That certain gestures are, you know, there's certain standard gestures mean certain things, and then there are other things that the orchestra picks up from a particular conductor, because all conductors are different.
You've heard the thing about Furtwängler to bring small.
Oh, exactly.
That his beat was so
uncertain. About 4 or 5 times and sit down and then play, and that's, you know, and that's right.
Well,
they couldn't find the downbeat.
The third button on the jacket.
Right.
It's the downbeat.
Exactly. Sure. Exactly. Right. Or, you know, or von Karajan, right, who conducted with his eyes closed, and you look like a sorcerer, you know, over a cauldron, right? And the orchestra knew exactly what every one of his gestures, the flinch of an eye, what it would mean, you know. Richard Strauss, who was the mentor of one of my conducting teachers, conducted in a very conservative way, very minimal, almost in a disinterested way. And then when he wanted a big sound, all he had to do is just go like this with his hands, and the orchestra would erupt into this enormous sound, right? So there's a language of gestures that is both standard and also then developed
personal and idiosyncratic.
Exactly. Okay. There's that. So what does a conductor do with these gestures? Well, He indicates, for example, how fast he wants the music to go, right? Which we call the tempo. He indicates where the downbeats are in the meter. Okay, most pieces in the standard repertoire are written in meter, 4
In a
beats per
standard
measure,
pulse where the strong beat happens at
right.
predictable intervals.
Exactly. So, it could be 3 beats in a measure, 4 beats in a measure, and so on and so forth, right? Very often players are looking, as a matter of fact, those guys that are sitting back there, the tuba player, okay, and the Dvorak New World Symphony, okay, has to sit there and wait until he can come in. Any of these low brass players in Beethoven, trombone players in Beethoven, right?
They're sitting there.
Count measures and count and count and count and count, and then be prepared to come in when the conductor cues them. That's another job that the conductor has. One of my old conducting teachers, Otto Werner Müller, it said it in very simple terms. It says a conductor is basically a traffic cop with really big ears, listening and controlling. Okay, so now you come in, now you cut off, right? You're too loud. Okay, now a little louder over here, this and then so on, right? And so he's directing traffic in a sense, sonic traffic. And people have to realize that each player has an individual part in the whole.
But players can miscount. Players can make mistakes.
Exactly.
Players can get distracted while counting 94 measures of rest.
Absolutely.
And the conductor has to know that I don't have to cue the violas over here because they dropped out for a measure. But that bass trombone that's about to come in, he's fallen asleep,
That's right. Exactly. So tempo and meter. The conductor also in rehearsal has to make sure that the orchestra is playing together. Okay, so he's listening, right? The traffic cop with the big ears, he's listening to make sure that everyone is playing at the same time.
But let me
the right notes, right?
Yeah, let me highlight that just for a moment, especially because so many of the people watching of the students are not conductors, but are players who have an issue with what I encounter often in my private teaching studio, especially an issue with not knowing how to practice. So one of the big things that we need to talk about in rehearsal technique for a conductor is knowing that, okay, this first movement, not an issue. This second movement, that's where the bodies are buried.
That's right.
And we need to start from the second movement. And in fact, we need to start not just from the beginning of the second movement, but from the trio section, where we always have ensemble issues.
Sure. Exactly.
Whereas an orchestra, you put 40 people on stage together and you say you tell them, guys, rehearse. If they were to start at the beginning and plow their way through the same mistakes that you probably have, that you listeners probably have in your private practicing, where you plow through the piece, and at the end of that plowing through, it is every bit as messy as it was when you started, because you've just encountered the mistake and continued past the mistake after maybe correcting it, but not fixing it so it never reoccurs.
Right.
So the conductor has to know what to rehearse in a limited rehearsal.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So that's exactly right. And speaking of that, you made me think of a Fellini movie called Orchestra Rehearsal. I don't know.
One of my mother's favorite movies.
Yes, and it's actually the whole thing is it's really about Italian politics, but it uses the orchestra as a kind of like as a vehicle for that.
Yes.
Everybody hates everybody else. Nobody gets along, right? And everybody hates the conductor. But that so conductors so orchestras need a conductor. Most orchestras do. There are orchestras like Orpheus, for example, where they get together and they have basically, they have a rehearsal where they all decide we're going to do this here, like almost like an expanded string quartet. They decide how they're going to interpret the piece. They all of that, and then they do it. But for the most part, most of the orchestral world needs conductors. They need players appreciate someone that they could actually follow, as long as it's someone that they can trust.
Right.
Someone that they respect and they can trust. And then they'll follow, the conductor to the ends of the earth, like the captain of a ship, that kind of thing. Not that anybody follows me, but Nobody even watches me. I mean,
there has not yet been a conductor who has not complained about, just watch me, for
yeah,
God's sake, just
exactly,
watch
exactly. Right, yeah, right. At least my players admit that they don't watch me, you know.
me.
So
You know the old joke about the principal viola unexpectedly called upon to conduct.
no, I don't know that one. What's that one?
So he conducts the concert and it goes very well. And the next day he's back in his seat and his stand partner turns to him and says, "Where were you yesterday?"
That's great. I think I might have heard Howard say that joke at some point. Okay, all right. Let's get back to it. So the orchestra needs to be playing together. They need to be playing the right notes. They need to be playing the right rhythms. They need to be playing the right notes in tune. All right. So you're listening, and you're listening to make sure that like the second violins are in tune. All right. Okay. There may be one player that's out of tune, but in this day and age, Fritz Reiner no longer exists. Fritz Reiner would probably throw the guy out. Right. You don't do that nowadays. It's a what did George Herbert Walker Bush say? It's a kinder, gentler world, right?
Gentler, yes.
A kinder, gentler world in the orchestra. So conductors don't do that anymore. So instead of calling out a player or singling out a player, you have to use psychology, and you have to say, okay, all right. Okay, second violins, let's try this again. Or how about by stand or something like that? You
don't want to shame people,
no.
But you do need to fix the problem.
Exactly. All right. So a conductor is juggling a lot of things at the same time. He's thinking about a lot of things. He's listening and thinking and counting and watching, and there's a lot of stuff going on.
And that's just in the rehearsal hall.
That's just in the rehearsal hall, and hopefully most of the work is done in rehearsal, so that when the performance comes, then it's a different, then it's at a different level, and then then everybody has the joy of making music together.
But still, in performance, heaven forbid. I mean, it probably doesn't happen, with a major symphony like Berlin or New York. But it can happen with community, or it can happen with regional orchestras. Someone gets lost.
Oh, hey, listen, speaking of major orchestras and speaking of Berlin, I saw a performance of the Berlin Philharmonic under Abbado do the Debussy Nuage, the three nocturnes, right? Mm-hmm. So they're in the middle of Nuage, where the clarinets are supposed to come in and do their thing, and the clarinets don't come in time, right? Okay, they miss a beat. And Abbado's eyes turned into like water balloons, okay? Like his eyes got like really big, So this is a major symphony orchestra. I remember being in Boston Symphony Hall, and I'm trying to remember what the piece was. I can't remember at the moment, but I remember seeing the Boston Symphony break down and have to start the piece all over again. So
in performance,
we're only human beings. This is the thing.
Who was conducting? You don't remember that?
It was Ozawa.
Ozawa was conducting Boston, and they had to restart.
That was when he was music. When I was at the conservatory, Ozawa was music director of the Boston Symphony, and they had to start the movement over again. I forgot what piece it was, and it was like one of those pieces. Like, I can't believe it. It's like a piece that is
right. This is the thing. It's not a world premiere of a piece that doesn't sound comprehensible to normal human ears.
No, it was standard repertoire. Yeah. It was standard repertoire. It was like something like, Holst the Planets, or it was like one of those big orchestra pieces, and I just couldn't believe it,
And I mean, when something, and not if, when something like that happens to me, let's say in a recital, or even in a concert with orchestra, I have a memory slip, or something goes wrong. As a soloist, I can hop here and there. I can, funnel around for a couple of measures and then rejoin the line
and find your book.
Yeah. I'm kind of on my own in that sense, and I do not bear the responsibility for making sure to not lead 20 other people astray.
Right.
God forbid the concertmaster, the first violin sitting on the first chair outside, God forbid the concertmaster cues the section at the wrong moment. 20 violins come in at the wrong time because they trust their leader. Right. And then it is up to the conductor, if at all possible, which, as Maestro Berard's stories show, it isn't always possible. If at all possible, you try to avoid the train wreck.
Right. Exactly. And
That language of gestures will hopefully show the violins,
right.
guys, you're one
Sometimes,
measure ahead.
or sometimes you just have to call out a number as discreetly as possible, a measure number. I had that happen. It was the last movement of the Beethoven Third Piano Concerto, and the soloist was in the middle of the cadenza and then had a memory lapse. Just stopped playing, literally stopped playing. And I'm like, and I'm looking like this, and he looks at me like, "Save me," right? And then, of course, what I did was very quickly I called out the measure number for when the orchestra comes back after the cadenza, and luckily it was one of those junctures that was easy enough for the players to figure out, right?
Few enough players coming in after the cadenza.
Boom, and then there we are, and then we finished the piece together, But I mean, even I remember like James Levine, talking about performances with the Metropolitan Opera, okay, and how was it with the Met Opera or was it with Munich? Maybe might have been with the Munich orchestra. And he was talking about how, like, they could be doing, like, they do 2 or 3 performances in a weekend and not all of them are going to be the same. That's just the way it is. It's the nature of the beast.
I remember as a student playing with Kurt Mazur, conducting the Manus Orchestra. By the way, I also am a fellow Yaley. But after Yale, there was Manus, and Mazur conducted, it was the Mendelssohn Reformation. And the rehearsals were all at the new Manus building, and the performance was at a church, large church with all of the attendant, very boomy acoustics. And I am not exaggerating. He took the tempo almost twice as fast for the last movement.
Wow.
In a far boomier space.
I can't believe that. Wow.
So how you can, cope, at that point you totally rely on the conductor.
Yep.
Everybody in the orchestra does have to be of sufficient technical quality to be able to play it slower, faster, however the conductor indicates. But you could be the world's greatest technician if you and the 3 stands behind you are not playing the same thing at the same time. It's a total disaster.
That's right.
So at that moment of the traffic cop with the big ears, there is sensing when the forces are starting to
unravel.
Yeah. So I actually want to talk a little bit also about that issue that you are aware of the quality of the orchestra you're conducting. Conducting the PG Philharmonic is one thing, conducting the Boston Symphony is another thing. So in selecting the players that will make all these huge differences, how you select players for I've talked with previous guests, how you select players for, let's say, the Sydney Symphony, for the BBC.
Sure.
But how do you select players for a smaller orchestra where you may not have the luxury of choice of choosing people who are ironclad technicians?
Well, it really depends on it really depends on what you're trying to do. Okay, I mean, there are community orchestras and then there are community orchestras. Some community orchestras are made up of anyone that wants to join. It doesn't matter what level they're at. It's all about, let's just get together and rehearse together. Let's put on a performance for our family and friends, and let's have the joy of making music together on some level. Okay, and then there are organizations like the Prince George's Philharmonic, which are like, the Cadillac of community orchestras. So you always have to think about the players that you already have. You have to think about the ensemble that has been created over the past 55 years of history. So in other words, it's like, it's like the doctor's, right? What is it? What is a doctor's oath? Like, do no harm.
First, do no harm, right?
Exactly. Okay. So you don't want to do that to your players. You don't want to do that to the orchestra. You can't accept everyone that auditions, right? So,
but how many people would you have audition for a solo spot in the woodwinds?
Oh, it depends. I mean, you could have. I'm trying to remember. Recently, we had a situation like that. Actually, it wasn't for a principal position. It was just simply for a clarinet position.
Second
And
clarinet or
yeah, and then we had I don't know, about a half a dozen people show up to audition, you know,
which already,
and they were good.
six candidates for one spot.
And they were good. And actually, we were in the position where we could pick someone. We could and then we can also like pick people as subs. We could actually create a sub list, on in addition to that. So we've been very blessed actually with having quality people show up to audition to the orchestra. But even still, I mean, what do I listen for? First of all, I listen for intonation. Okay, that's number one. If a player can't play in tune, it's like that old adage, an army is only as good as its weakest soldier or whatever, that kind of thing. I mean, it's an exaggeration, but certainly you don't want to do any harm. You don't want to stick a violin in the seconds or even in the first. Well, in the seconds, they can't play in tune. Obviously, it can't be a first violin, but you don't want to let them play in the second violins if they can't play in tune, because they're going to destroy the rest of the section.
The cohesiveness of the section playing as one.
Right, exactly. So so that's important. They have to play in tune. So students that are out there listening, you have to listen to yourselves. You have to record yourselves practicing, listen, and then play it back, right? Play it back, listen, and then see with your music in front of you, circle the notes that perhaps were a little bit out of tune and go back and work on it, your teachers, I'm sure, will tell you, to go through it, play through it slowly, this and then so on, right? All the ways.
How to do it is yet another, hours long conversation.
Right, exactly, and then how to change your technique so that you actually hit the note in tune. You try to hit the note in tune.
But the importance of intonation. This is what I'm so happy to hear you saying this. This is what I tell my students all the time.
It's number one.
If you are not intonationally reliable, you are a liability.
You're a liability.
Orchestra select a liability.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, right.
So that's number one. What's number two?
Right, and no one in your section will talk to you.
Right. Because actually, in all joking aside, you will get dirty looks from other players within your section, because essentially you're making them look bad.
Exactly. Right. Because they feel like they practiced and they learned their part and they're playing it pretty in pretty good intonation, and then you come along and climb it up, right?
Yeah.
So, right. Yeah.
This was a beautiful bottle of wine until you dropped this stick bug in it.
Right. All right. So intonation is one thing. The quality of the sound obviously is another one. Okay.
What do you mean by that?
The quality of sound is not only like how sweet your sound is, but also you don't want somebody who also sticks out in the section. That's why soloists make very poor section players. Right?
Guilty.
Okay. Right. Unless I was thinking about this earlier. It's like, unless it's an orchestra made up entirely of soloists. I mean, what would that be like? Would that be a disaster?
That's an experiment I'm trying right now in New York with my organization, Bacchanalia, Chamber Orchestra, where my mother's vision was an orchestra of soloists.
Wow.
And so far, the experiment is not conclusive. I'll let you know once there's reliable data.
But no one has killed anyone else yet, right?
Yet.
Okay.
Operative word.
Okay. All right. It makes me think of that Fellini movie again.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think it was an accident. This was Mom's favorite movie of all time.
That's interesting.
But
and then, of course,
so
there's
sound quality that blends as opposed to.
Yeah, exactly. So you listen for a player that's going to blend well in a section, regardless of whether it's a string section or woodwind section or whatever. So you listen for that. You listen for and usually you throw the music that's contrasting. You ask them to play contrasting music, hopefully different style periods, right? So
we've talked with other guests also about excerpts and what one may expect for auditioning for New York Phil, etc. But I think at every level, correct me if I'm wrong, at every level, if your first excerpt is a Mozart symphony, your second excerpt is probably going to be Debussy or Strauss.
Right. It should be contrasting. It should be contrasting both in style, contrasting in tempo, contrasting in character, right? Okay, because a slow lyrical piece obviously demands a different kind of musicality, right? Than perhaps agility and technique, right? In the fast piece. Not to say that the slow music doesn't require technique. Sometimes it requires a tremendous amount of endurance in terms of technique. But But the point is that you want players to play contrasting stuff, so you get a sense of what they're like in different styles.
Right.
And then of course, yeah, there's sight reading. You want.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's sight reading. You want to know if they, huh?
You were about to explain what role does sight reading play in selecting someone?
Well, you want to see how good they are at learning something quickly. With the PG Phil, we rehearse once a week. So as soon as we finish one, let's say we have a concert on a Saturday night, the following Wednesday we begin rehearsals for the next day, for the next concert. So
in that time, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday.
Exactly. So
you don't want players showing up who are learning the part for the first time in the first rehearsal.
Exactly, and presumably they're already working on the repertoire for the next concert while we're still rehearsing the previous one. But you certainly want players that can read well, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So so there's that aspect of it.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask, where do you, among all these sort of prerequisites, where would you place rhythm?
Rhythm? Rhythm. Are you talking about in terms of sight reading, or in terms?
No. In terms of a steady pulse, in terms of accurately.
In terms of that they prepared already. Yes. They came up already. Oh, that's extremely important too. And so you start circling 16th notes that turned into 8th notes or something like that,
or 30 seconds for that matter. Yeah.
But yeah, that also the other way around. So so rhythm is very important. Rhythm is rhythm, playing the right pitch and the right rhythm is like this, right?
Okay? Yeah, it's really the I don't know, the flour and the water in making dough.
Right.
You can't.
Yeah.
I often illustrate this to my students by humming the Star Spangled Banner with no rhythm and ask them how long it takes them to recognize what it is that I'm humming. Right. Or if I start playing the Star Spangled Banner with every note literally out of tune, how long before they beg you to stop?
Right.
But it's funny because with some conductors, one conductor in particular that I talked to said, if I have to choose between somebody with poor rhythm or poor intonation, I'll choose the guy with poor intonation for the orchestra. I might be able to, get his intonation to sort of be strengthened by the other players.
Yeah.
But somebody who tends to rush or tends to drag is going to get the entire section to rush or drag.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well.
So for different conductors, of course, it's going to be a slightly different metric.
Right.
If you absolutely have to accept somebody, you must fill this post, and you are conducting, let's say, a community orchestra, not even a regional, fully professional one. If you had to pick intonation or rhythm.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a silly question now that I think of it, because the reality is you're never going to have a situation where you must fill the spot, but there's no one to fill it.
Right.
The likelihood is that you have more candidates than there are spots.
Right. No, that's true. That's right. And luckily I have a situation where usually I can turn somebody down as opposed to say, well, you know what, I really need like another viola. So, I'll take this person, and take a risk on them. But by my experience, usually somebody that plays out of tune is likely to also not be very strong in the rhythm department either. It's just a general kind of like a musicianship question. Except unless the technique is preventing them from actually hitting the notes properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a different thing.
The self-perception that is involved in playing with poor intonation, I think, would preclude someone from accurately assessing whether they are accurately playing the rhythm that's on the page. Right. The page says C sharp. Right. I have no clue that I'm actually playing something that's closer to a C. Yeah. With that cluelessness, I probably don't know that, I just played an eighth note and it's a quarter.
Yeah, I would say probably one thing goes hand in hand with the other. The other thing that I actually have the luxury of considering that major professional orchestras, they're verboten in major professional orchestras, is personality. Okay, is this person going to be a team player or not? Are they going to be contributors to the ensemble that way? Are they going to be good citizens? That kind of thing.
Right.
You sort of get that sense when you're listening to the player. And I should have prefaced this all by saying that this is a situation where the player is actually sitting in front of me, and usually the concert master as well is sitting next to me listening, right? But with major symphony orchestras,
Well, there's
play
a trial period.
Huh?
There's after someone wins an audition.
Well, there's the trial period after that, sure, right. But I mean, the audition itself is conducted completely anonymously, so you can't tell if the person unless you have like really, really good ears, you can't tell if the person is male or female, right?
Much less if they are, kind or a jerk or
exactly. That's right. Right. So, that's why orchestras do have that trial period for sure. Right. So there all of that comes into play in auditioning. But first and foremost, it has to be the intonation and the sound, and then the rhythm, right? All of that. Yeah.
And when we're talking about PG Philharmonic specifically, but as a representative of the community orchestra,
yeah.
Do the auditions get conducted in front of a committee, or just you and the concertmaster?
No, it's just the concertmaster and myself.
What would you say the advantage to a committee versus, I can argue both cases, I think.
Well, I mean, the whole business of committees really is a matter of, it's really a politics, right? I mean, it's politics driven. I mean, it's all about, it's all about like proper representation and this and then so on, right?
That you're not going to foist a player on us, you conductor.
Exactly.
We the collective have to be
exactly.
on board.
And if you are auditioning a wind player, by golly, we're going to have members of the wind section in on that committee to witness the audition. It's not just going to be, the conductor, assistant conductor, and the concertmaster, that kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, things get more complicated. Basically, the bigger the budget of the orchestra gets. I mean, it's all the League of American Orchestras has like all that tier system, right?
Okay. We should tell the audience about that system.
Yeah, and it's all and a lot of it basically is based on how big the operating budget of the organization is, because that's an indication of how wide their scope is, right? Okay.
And that budget will affect how many performances they do.
Sure.
How many of those performances are the same program.
Sure.
There's a separate budget item for solo fees. So an orchestra that has the top tier of budget for operating expenses usually will be top tier for solo fees, but not necessarily.
Right. Yep. And it determines everything. I mean, what they pay their players, beyond the minimum that the whatever the union requires, right? It's like the Yankees, right? Why are the Yankees so great? Because they have a huge bankroll and they can afford to draft the best players, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And keep them. So it's like the same thing. So the bigger the stakes, the more people are going to be defensive of their territories. That's the bottom line.
And by the way, before I go on with the question, I want to once again remind listeners that we are open for questions throughout. I'm not going to keep the maestro indefinitely, so if you do have questions, please do chime in sooner rather than later.
Well, maybe we're answering all their questions as we're talking. I don't know.
Maybe we are.
I hope we answered the question about what a conductor does. I mean, a conductor does a lot of stuff.
We didn't get into the financial side of it.
No, that's right.
We probably should.
Yeah. But then there are other officers like the executive director, and then of course again, according to how big your operating budget is, then the more people that you have, as officers in the organization involved in the finances and the fundraising and this and that, so on, blah blah blah, all of that.
As somebody who has studied with so many European masters, I'm sure you're familiar with the sort of surprise European conductors feel when taking up an American podium and suddenly finding that one of their, important jobs is fundraising.
Yes.
They have to glad handle at fundraisers.
Oh yeah, well, it's not only just fundraisers. It's stuff like Halloween programs are really popular with families. So let's have the maestro get wheeled out in a coffin and have him crawl out of the coffin and then conduct the orchestra.
And you try explaining that to Yuri Temirkanov and see what you get. I mean, other than a baton in the eye, what do you get?
Right, exactly. So yeah.
But the question that I was going to, or rather the follow up that I was going to go with auditions, the advantage of a smaller group is, of course, the quick decision option, the possibility that that you're not going to get into a political infight that people have to sort of tactically negotiate around one another's agenda.
Right.
But one of the disadvantages is, of course, that I find this with listening to my own recordings. Do I want take one, or maybe I want take seven, or maybe take five? Let's listen to take five again. Oh God, I can't make up my mind.
Right.
Do you ever have one of those moments?
What do you mean, with recordings?
No, more with performers. Like, should I take candidate one? Maybe.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, not really. I mean, I can, in the end, it's actually my decision, who's accepted or not into the orchestra. And usually, David Yarborough, my concert master, is like whispering into my ear saying, no, I think this person goes. My tendency is like, well, I don't think so. And then he says, well, I think they're going to work out, and he's seeing something and hearing something and sensing something because he has a really good sort of sixth sense. Which is why I think it's really good. I think, I think leaders should have good people around them.
Yeah.
Right. Kennedy had like a great cabinet, that kind of thing. Right. And it looks like
the ability to pick talent that will in turn pick other talent.
Exactly. Because, no one is infallible.
Yeah.
So I might be saying, well, I don't think this person's going to work out, but he might be saying, you know what, let's try them. Would you be willing to try them? And I said, well, okay, if you say so. And then it turns out that he was right, that person actually worked, their derriere off and actually became a contributor
right.
to the section.
So sometimes the decision by committee, even a committee of two, right. Can introduce a viewpoint that you might not have otherwise come to.
Right.
I remember doing seating auditions at Catholic University with a conductor at the time. Mm-hmm. And there were a number of players that came in, and I was underwhelmed by their just straight up violinistic ability. Yeah. And then one guy came in and played, just knocked it out of the park in terms of the audition. Every part of the, all the excerpts were excellent. His solo stuff was excellent. Mm-hmm. And I said, listen, David, you'd be crazy not to put this guy concertmaster. And that was one of the worst concertmasters the orchestra had ever had.
Yeah.
Because I was listening as a violinist to a violinist.
Right.
And I wasn't thinking about how or whether this person knew how to lead the section.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly right. I mean, the world is full of that. The world is full of great practitioners that turn out to be lousy teachers, right?
Jascha Heifetz was not a great teacher. Sorry.
Yeah.
But similarly, there's also the people who, if you ever hear them play, you're wondering how they can possibly teach. Which goes back to what you were saying earlier. The conductor not only doesn't play every instrument, the conductor may not even be that wonderful an instrumentalist on their one chosen instrument.
That's right.
Eugene Ormandy played the violin.
I can't remember.
I know he was a string player, but
sounds right. Yeah,
it might have been cello. But again, we don't even know what instrument he played. We know he was a string player, and I certainly have never heard a recording of his playing. Right. Kusevitsky played the double bass.
Yeah. So did Zubin-Mehta, right?
Yeah. But then you have of course, the conductors who are magnificent instrumentalists. Daniel Barenboim is a legendary pianist for a reason. Leonard Bernstein was, a god of the piano too.
Right, but they already had like careers in their instruments. They
had the career that they then.
Yeah, Ashkenazi is another one, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
Barenboim is another one. They had their first careers were as pianists, and then in the case of Ashkenazi, right? What was it, that it was like an injury or something that sort of turned him to conducting?
I didn't realize. Maybe it was just, the old joke about what the difference is between a violinist and a conductor. Do you know this?
No, I don't know that one.
Dollar, 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 dollar. $1,000, $1,000, 1,000.
Yeah, in our dream. Yeah.
But we can also talk about that in terms of the maestro myth that you mentioned before,
Right.
in terms of the finances. A conductor's job can indeed be lucrative, can't it?
Oh, it can be. Sure. Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
it's the usual lottery. I think of it as a sort of, like NFL players. If you win that lottery,
Yeah.
you have won, untold success. But the number of people buying the lottery tickets, the number of people competing in that lottery,
Yeah.
doesn't often get remarked upon.
Right.
So
That's
for
right.
every one person who lands that dream
Of
conducting
course.
job,
Of course. It was just recently mentioned somewhere. I'm trying to remember. But it was recently mentioned in somewhere, some medium that I was either reading or listening to or watching or whatever, that the world is full of great artists, of great talent. Let's just put it this way. Let's turn it into generic terms, right? Great talent. Oh, I know what it is, and it was something that I read. Talent and fame don't necessarily equate all the time. Correct?
yes.
Right. Okay, so you can be famous, and there could be somebody that's actually more talented than you, but you're the one making the big bucks because somehow whatever it is,
You lucked out,
you
circumstances.
lucked out or you manipulated your way into whatever. There are lots of ways of getting there, or not, and so yeah, so just because you're famous, or just because you're not famous, does not mean that you're not talented.
People conflate the two.
Right.
If I haven't heard of this person, it must mean I haven't heard of them deservedly because they're not good.
Right.
And at the risk of sounding either immodest or like I'm tooting my own horn, I well remember the conversation after a debut concert with a regional orchestra. I won't even mention the state, but it was in the United States. It was a regional orchestra, fully professional. And after the debut concert, which went very well, a Tchaikovsky concerto, I was having dinner in the backyard of one of the board members. All the other board members are there. And alcohol is flowing, so people are becoming uncharacteristically honest.
Yeah.
And one of the board members corrals me and he says, I just have one question. How do we get you so cheap? He said, we had famous soloist acts that I'm not going to mention, last season, and we paid literally 10 times what we paid you.
Right.
And I did not enjoy the performance, and the audience didn't seem to enjoy the performance nearly as much as we did tonight.
Right.
And I said, well, that is something that you might want to discuss in board meetings. Where is your money most, well spent?
Well, because they probably paid for the name, right?
Yes.
The name recognition.
Precisely, and the
That's
prestige.
what everybody wants. So everybody wants to buy a brand name, correct?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to buy the generic product, right? Not that you're a generic product. I'm not.
No, that's a very fair assessment.
No.
If you look at the active ingredient in some over-the-counter medication,
Yeah.
Whatever it is, Tums.
Yeah.
You look at the active ingredient in Tums, and then some packaging that looks like Tums but isn't Tums, and you look at the active ingredient, and it's the same active ingredient, but there's like a $3 price difference.
Sure, that's right.
Yeah. So I think the other thing that, again, we didn't really talk about, but there are financial considerations for a conductor in, I'm going to program this piece that has larger forces, and perhaps I will compensate by getting this lesser known soloist.
Right.
But then I have to answer to my board about how is it that we didn't go with this person that all of the non-musical members of the board have heard of, and instead went with this person whom they didn't hear because they didn't show up at the concert.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't particularly have that problem, because it turns out that, for one thing, we like to use people that are local. There's a lot of great local talent, right? Including yourself.
Thanks.
And so, we don't have to look far and wide for our soloists. There are organizations like the Johansson competition, right?
Absolutely right.
Produce unbelievably talented young players. Sphinx organization, right? So
does PG Phil do other orchestras work with competitions to say whoever you guys have as winner, we will have?
Absolutely. We have a great relationship with Johansson. Now, I think this was supposed to be a Johansson year, because I think they have theirs every 2 years, right?
Or 3? 2 or 3?
Something like that, yeah. And so anyway, I think this was supposed to be it, but they put it off until next spring or something. So I don't know, but so so there are a lot of there's a lot of great talent in the area, and so we don't have that problem. We really don't have that problem.
It's also an advantage, I think, for the smaller organization. I don't mean smaller in size, I mean smaller in budget. A smaller organization may not feel the pressure from their, financial sector, from their board, to try and land the very famous name, thereby using up the entire season's budget at a go.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas if you are, a regional orchestra, presumably you might have that. A regional orchestra's board might say, well, listen, why didn't we get this household name, even though they would eat up our soloist's budget for the year?
Right. That's right. Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing, what I hope anybody watching this might be hearing, is that you're not seeing the same thing. You're not seeing the same animal when you go to a community orchestra concert versus a local orchestra versus the major, metropolitan orchestra. Here would probably be BSO and NSO. You are hearing an orchestra, but their similarities may stop.
Mm-hmm.
The size is different. The budgeting possibilities are different.
Mm-hmm.
The number of concerts is different. The number of rehearsals per concert is different.
Mm-hmm.
And different doesn't always mean worse.
Right.
Because how many rehearsals are you able to have with PG
Mm-hmm.
Phil for a given program?
Well, we usually do 7 rehearsals. The difference between us and, let's say, and another orchestra, like the professional orchestra, the professional orchestra will just rehearse that week and then perform that weekend.
Yeah.
It's a 9 to 5 job.
Yeah.
So that's it. They show up. It's a 9 to 5. The job. They rehearse that week, and then they do a performance very often on Thursday night, and then Saturday, or Friday and Saturday or something like that. So so it's a very quick turnaround for them.
And some of these aforementioned train wrecks may also owe something to that.
Sure.
If it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. If it's Wednesday, I must be playing Debussy.
No, that's right. Sometimes it could be like a factory. There's no question. The difference is that again, it has everything to do with your budget, what your mission is, what you can afford, and so on. And so you have organizations like the NSO that have wonderful musicians. They're all terrific musicians, and so the level of playing from the get-go is higher. Right. So there isn't a learning curve in terms of the rehearsal process. The players show up and they know the music. Right. Okay. But that doesn't mean that, I don't know how to explain this. It doesn't mean that it guarantees that the performance is going to be perfect. Right.
Or that they're going to ingrain the music, because still the echoes of last week's concert are echoing in your brain.
Right. Yeah.
I think yes, there is the advantage that a New York Philharmonic player at the first rehearsal knows the part cold. A community orchestra player may not know it as well, may not learn it as fast, but with 7 rehearsals, that music is lodged a lot more firmly.
Right. Yep. What was I going to say? The community. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. This I think is an important point, because I've seen this happen. That players of major symphony orchestras very often become jaded. They very often become sort of just humdrum. Oh yeah, it becomes a 9 to 5 job. It's like punching in and punching out at the end of the factory day. They go in, they do their work, they this and that, so on, right? Whereas when you have an orchestra. Whether you want to call it a community orchestra or a civic orchestra is another term for the same animal. The players very often put their heart and souls into what they're doing. So so there's a big difference there.
You're being demoralized sometimes as a conductor if you walk out on stage to a sea of indifferent faces in front of you.
Right.
Back to Toscanini, the story supposedly, although I can't believe it's true, that watching his concertmaster of whatever orchestra he was conducting that week, he was struck by how unhappy the man looked. And finally, at the dress rehearsal, he said to him, do you not like me? Do you not like the program? Do you not like the hall? And the man said, "Oh, maestro, please don't take offense. It's not that I don't like you. It's not that I don't like the hall. It's not that I don't like the program. I just don't like music."
Yeah, I know. Isn't that sad?
When you become overdosed,
Yes.
maybe it's just complacent.
Yeah.
I remember one of my positions, I guess you could call it, in my 20s, was to play in Japan, to play at the exhibition of artifacts from the Titanic.
Mm.
And it was a daily performance for hours and hours and hours, solo violin in memory of the musicians and other people who perished on board the Titanic. And as part of the package, I was housed in the Ritz-Carlton in Osaka. And the first week, coming home to this, not just 5-star, but 5-star with bells on, this astonishing hotel, gold-plated taps and all, coming home to this every day was unbelievable, joyful. By the 9th day, it had absolutely zero impact on me.
Right, sure. Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yeah.
Familiarity does breed contempt.
Yeah.
Maestro, we don't have any questions. Hopefully that means that we have answered every conceivable question about every aspect of music.
Every aspect of conducting, I doubt it. I don't think we even scratched the surface, but I hope that those that were listening got a little bit of a better sense of what a conductor does.
And what would happen with the absence of one, the chaos that would reign without you on the podium.
Exactly.
I should also point out that these podcasts are archived and housed. They can be viewed afterwards in their entirety and in segments. So hopefully anybody who didn't have a chance to catch us now will catch us later. I look forward to our chance to finally work together.
Absolutely.
Whether that's Beethoven or Four Seasons or anything else. Right. But it has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to have you as our guest today.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm so delighted that you asked me.
My pleasure.
It's been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And
all right.
Do you want to announce any upcoming PG Phil?
Oh, good Lord! It's everything has been so topsy-turvy with the COVID thing that we do have right now. We're working on actually one of those virtual performances where, like the Hollywood Squares, where we have all the members of the wind and brass section performing an arrangement of a Bach chorale. And that's coming up probably in February. So the rest of the season until we get to May, where we're going to be performing with Chelsea Green and the Green Project at Prince George's Community College. They have a wonderful new hall there, and it's a great home. That is actually the first time that we're actually going to be on stage for a while. We had a couple of performances, one in October, one in November, where we had just a skeletal crew. We just had about 16 players from the string sections, and we did standard chamber string orchestra music, the Dvorak and the Holberg and all the kind of stuff like that, just to sort of like to keep that pilot light lit.
Exactly.
Until
the group needs to continue playing together.
Yeah, until we can get the 80 players back on stage together. We have a big orchestra. I miss them, and I know that they miss playing together. And then hopefully things are going to work out with the vaccination thing, and we'll be all back on our feet soon.
But the February performance you mentioned is online.
It's going to be online, yeah. So if they watch like our website and our Facebook page, if people keep an eye on that, it'll be announced for sure.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you so much, Maestro.
All right. All the thanks is mine.
And I look forward to our encounter in Meet Space.
Okay. All right. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emil. All right.